issues of materiality, issues of labor, issues of womanhood. All of those questions that I was working through as an artist were actually best answered in a clothing line, not in a sculpture.
Hi, I'm Danielle, and you're listening to Unboxing Humans. Naomi Nomi was founded by Naomi Mishkin, an artist and designer currently making things in Brooklyn, New York. Trained as a glassblower, she spent a decade making sculpture before looking around her studio and realizing that all of her sculptures had sleeves and hemlines and were meant to be worn and worked in, not just looked at. As the granddaughter of a wedding dress manufacturer and the great-granddaughter of a pattern cutter, the schmata life was apparently hard to shake. So after years of sewing for herself and some friends, in 2018, she officially launched Naomi Nomi. The conceptual themes of her sculpture ring true in her clothes. Love your materials and put meaning in the making. Naomi, welcome to Unboxing Humans.
Hey, Danielle. So thank you so much for having me.
It is rare to get the opportunity to speak with someone who has done so much different creative work. And as we've heard in your bio, you are a ceramic artist, a glass blower, and now a fashion designer. I'm curious, what draws you to each of these different media?
I get bored really easily when it comes to materials is sort of the simplest way to put it. I've always been a maker. That's like my entryway to all things in life. I like using my hands, and I love making things. And so sort of like the first material I ever like really formally worked with was clay. My mom stuck me in like a clay class when I was little because I wanted to do everything my sister did. And from clay, I thought I was going to be a professional ceramicist from age 6 to 13. Then at 13, I got really bored. Or at 13, I started blowing glass, which is very similar to clay in many ways. That whole time I'd been sewing because my grandparents taught me how to sew. And then I learned to draw pretty much for college. I'm not an illustrator. I don't have an illustrative mind in that kind of way. I'm very much an object person rather than a two-dimensional illustration person. So I like to joke that I taught myself to draw basically exclusively for college, because at that point in college admissions for art programs, it was very much focused on observational drawing. And so I didn't know how to observationally draw anything. And so I did that. And then once I got into college, I welded. I kept blowing glass. I have a BFA in glass in my undergrad. And then I also got really into printmaking in college and everything. I like making things. So whatever the material is the message. So whatever I need to make and I need to learn how to work in that material, I do.
So at 6 years old, your mom put you in a ceramics class. And I mean, at 6 years old, I'm not sure that I knew that one could be a professional ceramicist.
I was like, oh my God, I just want to do this all day. So that's what I want to do all day for the rest of my life.
What was it about your family that enabled you to pursue these artistic ventures?
That's a great question. Actually, in many ways, my immediate family is not very creative in terms of like materials and the arts. My parents basically are finance people, and my mom pretty much was like a homemaker for most of my childhood. But my grandfather, my mother's father, had manufactured wedding gowns all throughout the 20th century. And so she came from a family that were makers and were sewers and like seamstresses, basically. My great grandfather had been a pattern cutter. My great grandmother had been a seamstress. In many ways, they just did that though because it was the early 20th century. And like, what else? Sewing is very much like an immigrant trade in many ways. I mean, and even today in many countries, it's easy to learn, hard to master. Even though my parents like weren't very like makers in themselves, my grandfather was. And his house, when you go over like on the weekends in Long Island, he had built my grandmother a sewing room off the dining room, and then he had a wood shop in the basement. And so basically like my whole childhood was spent like at their house on Saturdays and Sundays, like bouncing between the two spaces. Like, what do you want to make next? When they passed and we sold the house, probably there were like 700 unfinished projects between those two rooms. And then, but even though my parents weren't necessarily creative, they valued the arts and they valued creativity and they valued what I was doing. And so like my mom would take me to the Met, my mom would take me to MoMA. Like I was taken to like every museum a million times. Like that's just what we did. And it was always like the arts were always very valued, but it wasn't something that they necessarily were doing. Yeah.
So add woodworking to the list.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But I'm not a great woodworker because I never really did it super seriously, but like I can move my way around a wood shop for sure. But yeah.
What does being bored with ceramics look like? Like at 13, when you're like, oh, I need a different medium.
Yeah.
What was that feeling? How did you know?
I love ceramics and I like it was and the clay in many ways is like still sort of like a home material for me. Like I sort of think of my material practice as like right now I am most fluent in fabric and sewing and textiles. Like, and by that I mean like I feel most capable expressing what's up here through the medium of like making garments. But clay is a very close second in many ways because like you can make anything. Like it's just this and the ball of clay. Like that's it. And so I loved ceramics. I love the tactile nature of it. I love the skill aspect of it, like learning how to throw on a wheel. I learned on a kick wheel. So I only actually switched to an electric wheel in college. And so I had been a clay person for years at that point until I was like 14. And my mom put me in this really incredible camp that was it's called Bucks Rock. It's actually been around for like decades. My very good friend from high school, her mom had gone to this camp. It had started as basically, I believe my understanding is it was started as basically like a refugee camp for Jewish kids after the war. And then it sort of evolved into like this craft camp. And then it wound up, it's an incredible place where they have like a full performing arts side and a full visual arts side. And the only rule, if you go to the camp, and they only take kids from like 13, you can't be super young for it because you control your own schedule. And the only rule is you can't do nothing. So you have to be at one of the shops. Like you can do whatever you want. You can spend 100% of your time in the photo lab, but like you can't just be in the bunk doing nothing. And that was like heaven for me. Like I truly believe that heaven is art. You can just move from studio to studio and like keep making projects. And so there they had glass. And so my mom, I'm pretty sure, sent me there thinking, she was like, oh my God, my daughter's going to learn how to blow glass. And then she called me like a few days before picking me up my first year at the camp. And she was like, and how was glass blowing? And I was like, I didn't do it. I was scared. She was like, I'm picking you up until you do it. I was super intimidated by glass because even though I had like a feeling that I would be good at it or like a feeling that I would like it, because it's ultimately glass in many ways. Oh, it's very common for ceramicists to move to glass because it's basically very similar principles, but just literally on a different axis. So like ceramics is top down or like vertically. Gravity is working vertically, and with ceramics, like water and clay is like what you have to sort of learn. And with glass, it's a horizontal axis, still working with gravity, but in a horizontal way, and it's heat. So heat is to glass what basically water is to clay, and so it's very, very transferable. But I was super intimidated because it was like, to be honest, like I was 14 at the time, and the main people who were in the glass shop were like really cool boys who I was like super intimidated by and was like obviously in love with all of them, but also terrified of all of them. And like, I don't like going over there. And I signed up and I did it. And the second I was like, fuck, I should have done this the whole time. Like, this is the best thing. And then I came back the next summer and basically did it every day.
Pretty much dropped ceramics, or you kept up the ceramics at the same time?
I had gotten kind of bored of ceramics, to be honest. So like, I remember going to that camp actually, and I went to the camp thinking like, oh, like that's where the ceramic studio was. And I was like, oh, I can go over there whenever I want. And I actually believe that I never even went into the ceramic studio when I got there. It was just like, oh, like I know how to do that. That's like a whole other world. But like there's so many, like there was leather arts, book arts, batik, weaving. It's a maker's dream to be there. And so I was like, I can deal with clay at home. I'm going to go to learn to weld. Like that was fun. Yeah.
So it's the inherent learning, just the interest that drove you.
Top ceramics like a hot potato. Like moved on. I basically did work with clay from age 14 till like my senior year in high school. I really dropped it very quickly and never really went to it. By the time I like got to middle school and high school, my friends who knew me as an artist never ever knew. They knew I had done ceramics, but they never had seen me do it until a lot of my friends were taking ceramics in high school. And so I started hanging out in that room. You went to my high school, the ceramics room.
I took ceramics, and I know exactly which room you're talking about.
Yeah. Renner, who was Mr. Renner, who was an incredible ceramics teacher.
Fantastic.
Really wonderful, just like creative art teacher. I really loved him. And even though he literally was never my teacher, because I never took ceramics, but I would hang out in that studio so much. And like my friends would be doing something. I'm like, don't do it like that. Like do it like this. Like, and so everyone like, they all knew I like had the experience, but like I like wouldn't sit down at a wheel. I like wouldn't do anything. I was just like, no. I'm like over this. I don't want to. Until kind of towards the end of senior year, I remember just like wandering up there one day and I looked at Mr. Ren and like it was after school, like everyone had gone home. He was just like finishing up some paperwork in his office. And I was like, can I throw? And he was like, yeah, sit down. And I sat back down and it felt like home. It was like so wonderful. And so that at that point, I had been very like sort of stressed that like I didn't like ceramics anymore, or not stressed, but like it didn't sit well with me. I was like, oh, like am I being flaky? I just like walked away from it. And I have very like emotional responses to materials also. Like they're relationships. Like I have a relationship with glass, I have a relationship with clay. And so when I sat down though to throw that day, it was just like, I'm home. Like this is like, I don't have to do this every day to know that this is one of my things. And so I've thrown every couple of years, I go through like a 6-month kick where I'm like, we're throwing a whole dish set today. And my husband's usually like, oh, and I'm like, yes, I'll be back. Yeah, ceramics is part of my life. It's like, it's never going anywhere. It's there. I don't see it every day. I haven't touched clay in 18 months, but like every couple of years, I'm like, it's like an itch that sort of comes back into my life.
So I similarly, but not to the extent, was put in every art class, every type of everything class. And I threw all through high school. I didn't touch it for many years. And then about 2 years ago, I finally signed up for a class on the wheel uptown right by Columbia University. And I just loved it. And I was like, oh my God, like I sat down and I suddenly remembered everything that Mr. Renner taught us. Well, taught me.
Memory. All these materials are muscle memory. And so like it really does physically take you back to like a place in your life. And like I usually, when I throw as an adult, it's actually very rare that I fire anything. I'm usually just like throwing out, throwing out, because it's a therapeutic activity for me. It's a process for me. I ironically, even though I'm a glass person, I like really don't like glazing ceramics. I'm bored. I'm already bored with it. By the time it's made, by the time it comes out of the fire, I'm like, I'm done. I just use it as a therapy, basically.
Because it's the making of it that's exciting for you. And the glazing, it's already made.
I lose interest with objects once they're finished. Like I lose it. For me, the most exciting thing about making things is making things. It's not having the thing that I made. It's the making the thing. So by the time it comes out, I'm always on to the next thing.
You were doing glass blowing outside of school, because I know our high school did not have glass blowing. I'm curious, where in New York City was there glass blowing?
So I mostly did in the summers at these like that sort of specialize in these things. And so like, and also what's wonderful is like the whole glass community from like age 14 to 90 is like 500 people in America. We all kind of know each other. The woman who like first taught me how to blow glass at that camp, like 20 years later, I saw her at a party for another glass guy. And I was like, how do I know you? And it occurred to me, like, the whole glass community is very, very small. And so those people come back in my life all the time. But no, I was mostly blowing glass over the summers. I tried, the only place to blow glass in New York City as a kid at the time was Urban Glass, which is a really incredible glass studio down in Brooklyn. I actually wound up teaching there when I was in my early 20s. And so I took like 1 or 2 classes at the time. I remember the timing didn't quite work out with my schedule. So I wound up only doing it a few times, but because we were up in the Bronx and that was all the way down in Brooklyn. So it kind of didn't work. So yeah, I mostly did it in the summers. Yeah. During the school year, during the school year, I worked in fashion actually at that time. My school year would be fashion and then my summers would be glass.
What did working in fashion look like?
So all throughout that time in my life when I was having a relationship with the glass and ceramics, I was also sewing. My grandmother had taught me how to sew. And then actually when my grandfather passed away in the 8th grade, I spent the entire time sewing handbags and tote bags in the study. And I basically went back to school and tried to see if my friends would buy them. And they did. They like bought all of them. And so between Thanksgiving and Christmas break, 8th grade, I sold $1,600 worth of handbags to my friends in high school. Each one was like $35 a piece. And I had everyone choose their fabric. I'll make them for you. And it was like the most exciting time And of course, I got my math final grade back and I got like a D on the math test, like a C minus. And my parents were like, it was not allowed. And I remember having like a really funny talking to with my mom, who was like, you're not allowed to run a sweatshop downstairs by yourself. And, you need to get your math grades up. And I remember being like, I don't understand. The whole point of being good at math, from what my understanding of this whole world is to be good in business. And I've already done that. So why can't we just skip the math part and go straight to the business part? And she was like, haha, nice try. It was like, if you really want to work in this industry, go get a job. And so at that point, one of the girls that I had sold a handbag to, I think the girl like bought a handbag for her and her mom, if I'm not mistaken. And her mother basically connected me to this designer, Charles Nolan, who at the time had just been the head of Anne Klein for a few years and was basically going out on his own. And she was like, he probably needs an intern. She gave me his email address and I emailed him being like, hi, my name is Naomi. I go to XYZ High School. I go to FIT on the weekends. And I'd love to work for you. And he wrote back being like, oh my God, I went to FIT and my husband went to that high school. Like, absolutely, come on in for an interview. And I showed up at the door. His studio at the time was on 38th and 8th. So we're 37th and 8th, right above the Starbucks that is still there. And he opened the door and literally was like, oh my God, you're a child. He basically thought I was in college already. He didn't realize that I was like a ninth grader. So yeah, he interviewed me and I was like, I want to work for you for free. And he was like, great. And his next question after, oh my God, you're a child, was, does your mother know where you are? And I was like, yeah. And for Charles, basically all through high school, Charles was like my full mentor. He wrote my college recommendation. I was his intern and did everything he could possibly need that a 14 to 17-year-old could do in New York City. And so by the time I left Charles to go off to college, I had basically worked like 6 or 8 Bryant Park shows. My mom would let me take off the week of Fashion Week. My mom would let me take off to help them prep for the shows. He paid me mostly in cashmere, which honestly is the best way for a 16-year-old girl to be paid. Like I never bought cashmere. I don't think I've ever bought cashmere. I'm literally still wearing Charles's all samples that he every couple of weeks he'd like throw me a trash bag full of like the most incredible samples you could ever want. And that's like how I got paid. And he taught me everything. He taught me how to be professional. He taught me how to run a business. He taught me how to like work with colleagues, how to like talk to mills, everything. And so I'm very indebted to him. He unfortunately passed away when I was a senior in college, but I actually like to say that like when I started Naomi Nomi, so he wasn't around when I started Naomi Nomi. Obviously, I'm still in touch with his sister and like other people that were in that world. But when I went to hire my very first full-time Naomi Nomi assistant, one of her references happened totally by coincidence was Charles's little brother. And I totally coincidence. And I messaged their sister. Charles's sister worked with him in the office, but he was from like big Irish Catholic Long Island family. So like there was like 7 children. There's 7 Nolan. We're amazing. And I texted Carol, the sister, being like, I think I might hire someone that used to work for Kenneth. And within 5 minutes, Kenneth called me and was like, you have to, she's great. And so I like to think that Charles, like, even though he couldn't be here to help me with my business, like he gave me the right-hand woman that I built this whole business with. So like he's here. So
He absolutely is that like the definition of he's here and he's watching.
Exactly.
And seeing like, everything you're building
is amazing. There's absolutely no reason. Like we clicked so well. She's my right-hand woman. She's now my production director. She's been with me for almost 3 years. Like there is no rational reason. I literally interviewed her in September 2020, peak COVID. She just graduated college. She was living on her mom's couch because no one was hiring. And I like basically convinced her to move to New York with like the promise of a 3-day-a-week job and like no written contract. And she got on a plane and came, and we've been attached to the hip ever since. There's no reason rationally why it should have worked as well as it did. And that's true.
That's just truly incredible. And so I'm curious now, you're working for him all through high school. You're clearly loving it and you're saying he's teaching you everything. But then you still decided to get a BFA in glassblowing.
Yeah, what I realized is that, and this kind of influenced by Charles, he kind of convinced me that like, he's like, don't go to Parsons, like don't go to FIT. He's like, what are they going to teach you everything that I just taught you? You don't need to do that. Go learn something else. And he was right. Honestly, by the time I was a senior in high school, I was managing the interns that FIT was sending us. So it was like,
wow,
now it's going to be useless. And so I wound up basically taking a tour of Cornell, originally for their fashion program. And I love Cornell's design program, but it's very much more technical. Like, if I wanted to be a textile artist, if I wanted to be like a textile specialist at NASA making astronaut suits, like, you should be at Cornell for that. But I realized what I realized in that was that I wanted to go to college to learn not what to think or how to do things, but I really wanted a classic liberal arts education, and that I wanted to learn how to think. And I firmly believe that a true art education is the perfect liberal arts education. It's basically English class with objects. That's like what it is. Great. I like a crit culture is English with objects. And so I wound up literally on Cornell's campus, wandering over to their art department and being like, oh, this is how I want to study. And so and I was like, oh, and that means I don't have to just do fashion. And because remember, I was being totally slutty with my materials, shall we say. Just like, I was painting every material out there. And so like, I was like, no, I'm a sculptor. Like, that's what I am. And so I went to Cornell and was incredibly lucky again, where I had a professor by the name of Douglas Ross, who was sort of a visiting professor at Cornell at the time, who had just been at RISD. And he kind of took one look at my work and was like, you need to go to real art school. And I was like, well, I always loved glass and that's my favorite material right now. And he was basically like, the RISD glass department is unbelievable. Like, get your ass over there. And RISD glass very much is a material specific sculpture department, which is perfect for me. I learned glass and I specialized in glass, but I made things in every material under the sun. And it was the right place to have that conversation intellectually, because the first question in every glass crit is basically like, why glass? So when I materials, it's like, why are you using that material? Why am I using a lyocell for this dress? Like, that ultimately, like, in many ways, art, or like a lot of my thinking around making objects, is like the relationship between what you're trying to say and the material with which you're saying it. And so like the glass department was the perfect place to have that intellectual conversation. And that's how I wanted as a BFA in glass.
I love how you follow the interests and like you're listening to what's interesting to you and what's exciting to you. But then these people are just coming in and like out of the blue making these huge impacts on your life. Yeah.
Well, I've always been someone who like really gravitates towards that happen, that like every material in my life has like a person who's like this they've brought me to there. Like, I'm even looking here at my desk. I keep this object, which is a clay object that was actually made by my very, very first ceramics teacher. This is like one of the most important objects in my life. And this was made by Carmen Soriano, who is like my OG ceramics teacher. And I've tried, no matter how many times I Google her name, I can't find her. But like, I love this. And so like, I've always had like mentors throughout. I've been really lucky. I've been able to find really amazing people who guided me on my material journeys.
How did you acquire the object from your teacher?
Really funny story. My art school, when I was the one that taught me ceramics, was this tiny little art school in New Jersey, and it was amazing. And one year they had an Easter egg hunt. And I really wanted to go to that Easter egg hunt. Like, I have heard of Easter egg hunts and they sound amazing. And this one was this really amazing concept for like an activity for an art school. They had given all of the art teachers a wooden sphere, and every art teacher in the school did something different with it. And then they either hid those objects or hid Polaroids of those objects all around the school for all the kids to come on Saturday and find their Easter eggs. And I happened to find Carmen's. So this was Carmen. So what she did is the ball was inside. She used this as like an internal mold, and then she covered it and then she fired it. So like you can kind of hear like it's kind of a rattle inside because it's a hollow clay or the hollow wood inside.
Oh, wow.
So it has a hollow sphere inside, basically, because it was made on top of this wooden thing. And the second you put it in the kiln, the wood burned up.
Yeah. Oh, how cool.
Yeah. It just has like a little, like there must be like one stray speck of clay that like got into the cavity, because you can just barely hear. It feels like a shading of a piece of clay that's like in the cavity.
What did you do once you graduated with your BFA in glassblowing?
Oh, great question. Fantastic. What do when they graduate with a BFA in glassblowing? I always joke that when English majors, they're like, oh my God, I'm an English major. It has no use. And they're like, it's the most useful degree you could possibly have. I'm like, I have a BFA in a 14th century outdated technology that really is all done in like 10 locations in the country. And so, but I love that. Like and that's sort of why also like it really is like the ultimate liberal arts degree in some ways. But what did I do? I got very lucky again, and I had a fellowship right directly after college. I had a fellowship, which basically allowed me to travel all around the world for like 16, 18 months, studying a very particular subject. So I was mostly in Berlin, Tel Aviv, and Sao Paulo, studying basically immateriality in art and the history of immateriality in art. Because since I was so obsessed with materials, I sort of had done like a total ricochet on myself and like gone to, okay, if I love materials, like why do I love materials? And that led to really studying immateriality. So I did that for the first basically like year and change after school. Then I got hired by Cabinet Magazine. I don't know if you know them. It's an amazing arts and culture magazine. It's very much a magazine for artists rather than about them. So it sort of takes the concept of like a cabinet of curiosities, and it takes like a topic, it's a quarterly, and it takes a topic, for example, like hair. And like it has like tons of different writers write on the subject of hair from like every different angle, like historian writing about hair, artists making a project about hair, scientists writing about hair, like all these different people writing about like hair as like a very expanded notion of like, let's study the subject. So I was there for about a year, realized I really hated sitting at a desk all day, and then wound up going to work for the artist Janine Antoni. And so I spent basically 4 years working for Janine afterwards. And she's a sculptor who, like me, works in a million different materials. And so I managed her studio I worked with her and I managed her studio for 4 years, which was incredible because every day was a different challenge. My job basically was if she came into the studio that day and was like, I want to make a sculpture where I hang upside down from a tree and there's gold components and wood components, and I want it to be 7 feet tall. Like it was our job to be like, okay, how do we make that happen? Well, okay. And so the job was very much like making art happen and and so I got a very hands-on, but also like practical understanding of what it means to run a creative business. My dog just walked in. Ooh, she is the world's best studio pup. She is. Oh, here we go.
For those who are listening, what kind of dog is she?
She is a Ridgeback, which basically means that she's gigantic and needs about 1 hour of balls to the walls running in the morning. And then after that, she is the perfect studio dog because she comes back and falls asleep for 22 hours. And she loves people and she doesn't shed on any of my fabric. And she's the best. I think a studio dog is like really, really important to have around. And it makes everyone bigger and calmer.
I never thought about that, but now that I think about it a little bit, I'm like, oh yeah, I know a bunch of designers who have studio dogs.
Yeah. I like a shop dog, a studio dog. Like it just sort of keeps everything like in perspective. It's like at the end of the day, I like to joke, like there is no such thing as a fashion emergency. Like everything can be handled. Everything can, like, everyone just take a chill pill. We're not curing cancer here. Like we are making clothes. We are making people very, very happy with those clothes, but like everyone needs to chill the fuck out. If there's no reason to be in crazy, crazy stress, like go hug the dog.
I love that attitude towards leadership because we are way, way, way too stressed as
like I hold my
society.
Like, insanely high standard. And like I am always saying, or we shoot for the moon and I know we're landing in the stars. So whenever I bring people on, I always also tell people like I'm a big proponent of crit culture. So like critique culture from art school, but like critique is not criticism. Like you need to understand that. And so like we're constantly looking for better ways to do things. Like that's what we do here. We do something and then we ask like, how can we do it better? How can we do it more efficiently? How can we make it more beautiful? How can we make it more practical? Like, how can we make this better? And so we have a strong crit culture in the studio, but which some people find very stressful. And so if that's not your vibe, you probably shouldn't be with Naomi Nomi. I'm very, very honest about that. But ultimately, all the crit is in good fun. Like that's the game. That's the game that I want to be playing. And so you need to with that, you need to keep it light. The dog.
For those who didn't go to art school or not familiar with the art world, can you describe crit?
So crit is short for critique. It's basically the test is to regular college what crit is to art school. So for example, you'll have your teacher will give you an assignment. Hey, we need everyone to make a sculpture by, here's the sculpture prompt. It's due on Tuesday. We'll have crit on Tuesday. And so on Tuesday, everyone walks in a very simplified version of this. Everyone walks in on Tuesday and everyone has set up their sculptures in like different parts of the room. And then depending on the class, you get like anywhere from 20 to an hour of like everyone in the room critiquing your work. So it is both like a test, but it's not really a test because there's no grade, obviously. It's also very public. And also it's being done by all your friends and your teachers. And it's ultimately there to like tease out like what is going on in the sculpture. Like it's a critique, like sometimes sometimes a crit can go like in the beginning of the 45 minutes, everyone hates it. And by the end of the 45 minutes, everyone thinks it's the greatest thing that mankind has ever produced. Or, like the crit can go like a really well-run crit is like really beautiful. And I think of a well-run crit is basically the way to think about it is like English class, but rather than talking about the chapter that you guys all read last night, you're talking about an object.
How do you do crit without critiquing as it relates to Naomi Nomi?
Sometimes there's a little bit of criticism by all means, and sometimes it can get really painful because like RISD has this teach saying, it happens. Sometimes the piece just really didn't work and you're just sitting there for 45 minutes getting pummeled by like every possible direction. And you're just like, well, I guess that's so I feel like glad I spent all my time on that. But like ultimately, like a great crit is like you come out knowing more about the work. You come out knowing more about whatever the assignment was. A professor who can run a good crit keeps everyone from attacking someone and really keeps the conversation moving. Ultimately, we're all there to learn more and ask more questions and understand more fully about the process of making art. And so a good crit will teach you more about what it means to make art. That's the most beautiful crit. And so that's in many ways how I run the studio. We had a sample come back this morning and we were looking at it and we were like, I'm on the fence about the button that's on it. Gabby, my assistant, thinks it's perfect. My husband walked in. He's like, I hate that. It's horrible. Get rid of it. But all opinions are welcome. And I want like everyone get it out. Like, what is it? And by everyone expressing their opinion, we come to where we are on it. Yeah.
That's beautiful. It's very growth mindset. It's because there's term for it now.
I think everyone should learn the crit is. I think like every high school student should like be in a crit. It's the reason I don't like calling it a test or relating it to a test, because a test is black and white and where a crit is like, it's not the point to know that you got it wrong. It's the point to know how to do it right next time.
Well, is it really even getting it wrong? I mean, it doesn't sound like it's getting it wrong. It sounds like it's understanding the piece and you and what you did and growing. Exactly what you said, how to do it better.
It's how to do it better. Like ultimately, it doesn't matter if someone's wrong. It's just like, I don't like to dwell on like if someone does something bad. I'm like, okay, how do we make this better next time? Especially if you're working in a startup. Like my pet peeve is when someone says something is bad and doesn't give me a way to make it better. And just adding to the negativity, because unless you come up with a way to make it better, the opinion that it's bad is pretty useless. And if you don't know how to make it better, give me a question. Probe at it, get at it. The probing and the questioning is way more important to me than any black and white opinion.
It's like, I don't like it. It's making me feel a certain way. And it's like, great, I can do something with that now. I can take it or not, but at least I understand what it is.
But I've done badly, it's traumatizing. It's all been there. Like, in fact, my husband wound up taking a bunch of art classes or like classes that had critique in graduate school. And I remember seeing him like after the first crits and I was like, crit happens. It's okay.
So we talked a lot about the Naomi Nomi culture, but let's jump back to what inspired you to actually take the dive and start it.
So speaking of crit, I was basically kind of in crit in grad school. I went to grad school for sculpture for an MFA in sculpture at Oxford. Actually, it's a very intellectual, very cerebral department. I realized that everything I was making had sleeves and a hemline. So I was in crit, and like a sort of a very classic dilemma for sculpture in crit is like, how do you get someone to touch a sculpture? Because the social norms around galleries and sculpture is like, don't touch. And I was like, I just want you all to touch it. And I want you all to touch it and put it on your body and like walk around and like leave and come back. And then I was like, I'm talking about a store, not a gallery. And I realized that actually like the sculptures I was making were way more functional and the context was wrong. Like they didn't belong in a gallery. They belonged in a store. or they belonged for people to like wear them and see them. And so, and like use them and touch them and abuse them and throw them on the ground and launder them. And so I realized that a lot of the conceptual questions that I had in my artistic practice at the time, which have sort of followed me throughout everything, issues of materiality, issues of labor, issues of womanhood, all of those questions that I was working through as an artist were actually best answered in a clothing line, not in a sculpture. And so that was the impetus for Naomi Nomi. In
And
fact,
how do you enter them in your clothing line?
I mean, our signature garment is an Oxford, is a shirt that was built for a man that I put on a woman, and that when women use it to work in. And it is, and we are material obsessed at this company. I want you to touch everything. We send swatch bars out. We question what materials are here. We're in constant dialogue about materiality and what it means to wear clothing and what it means to be a working woman and what it means. Yeah, all of those questions are things that my clothes talk about. And if they don't answer them, there is no answer. But the answer is in the lifelong quest of like, what does it mean? For example, one thing that I love is that our shirts button on the boys' side, quote unquote, the boys' side. And I don't know if you know what the boys' side is, but that's because women were dressed by their maids.
Yes.
So it's like, well, I don't have a fucking maid. So like it's going to be on the boys' side. And so like little things like that are like how we probe at this idea of like, what does it mean for a woman to wear this kind of shirt? What does it mean for a woman to feel powerful in this kind of shirt? How do I get her to feel powerful? How do I get her to feel ownership over a cut that is actually meant for a man? Well, and make the ass look really fucking good. You know, it's like, okay, the whole bottom of my shirt, the place where it's like really different from a boy's shirt is in the butt. It's in the curve of a woman's body. Like a woman's body is shaped for the general population. A woman's body is shaped very differently than a man's body. So it's like, okay, I've totally drastically changed the bottom of that shape to appeal to a woman. On the other hand, I don't put darts in my garments because that's like, I don't put darts in the tops of my Oxfords. And that is also on purpose. Like I don't want it to hug your bust necessarily. I'm making an Oxford that's not about the bust. My Oxford is about the body. My Oxford is about the collar. My Oxford is about framing your face. Ultimately, that's what a man's Oxford does. It frames their face. So like, I don't want to frame your boobs. I don't want them to be looking at your boobs. I want them to be looking at your face. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at. One of the questions I get all the time is, do we have darts in Oxfords? Absolutely not. And I think that's one of the main reasons that a large portion of my customer is non-binary. I think that, yes, we exist in the gray, like 100%. Like, come to me, like we are a brand for you.
That's so fantastic. I mean, so for those who don't know, because I remember learning this a few years ago with the buttons. So for those who have only been dressing themselves as women or as men, you have been used to buttoning in a certain way. But if you put the two shirts buttoned down side by side, you'll realize that which button is on which side. And you have like,
this one I don't even remember. I have to always turn around and look at my garments, but it's basically now our shirts favor the dominant right hand. So yes.
So you put your button is in your right hand if you're putting on the shirt.
I believe so. Yeah. I'd have to turn.
Yeah. Versus when women were dressed, because it favored a maid's dominant right hand, the buttons were flipped.
Right.
And every piece of garment going forward has just been made that way for no reason besides that's the way they've been made.
And it doesn't even make the garment look better because then where the pocket is, it's like interrupts it. It's terrible. I hate it. But why don't do it?
And so what does it mean to change the cut in the way you were saying? Like I'm thinking about a traditional button down and how they're often designed to be tucked in. And is that what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, my button down works to be tucked in and works to be out. It also works to be tied up. That's a big style that I like doing, like the little knot at the waist. You know, again, like I'm designing for a female form. Like we got a waist. And so those are all the kinds of things that I'm thinking about when you design for a female form. But also like I design for a female form, but also like a very expanded notion of what it means to be a female. Like I've had trans women in here. I sit down, like I've had anyone who identifies as a woman in any way. First of all, I would be very clear. That's what I mean by designing for a woman. There's a wild variety of body shapes within that. And that's actually one of the most beautiful things about women. I think that like there's much more body variation in women's bodies than there is in men's bodies. And then ultimately, but what it means to design for a woman, what I mean that to be, is something I think about a lot is that if you ask a man what their favorite garment is or why they like their favorite garment, usually they're going to say something about the fit or the way that the fabric feels or like the lining or like an internal pocket. Everything that they're talking about is very much from the perspective, if you think about male gaze, female gaze, of their personal gaze, like who they are, like it's an inside out kind of appreciation of the garment. Whereas what I noticed as I was like sort of researching when I was first starting the brand and even just in years prior making clothing, if you ask a woman why she likes her favorite garment, she'd be like, oh my God, I love the applique. I love the sparkle. I love the color. It's very much something that the viewer is looking at her about. And we've taken away the woman's agency in it. And so when I say I design clothes like a menswear, what I'm saying is I design clothes from the inside out. I believe if we think about the concept of sculpture and audience, for the sculpture, if we make the garment the sculpture, the first audience, the primary audience is the wearer. And so that's what I'm designing for. I'm designing for the wearer. Yes, and of course, I'm designing for the viewer. Absolutely. That's what clothing's about. But like the first barrier is the wearer. And that is what I focus on most. Or that's where I put my emphasis on in design.
And that's where our confidence comes from, because when we put something on and we feel good in it, then we're able to take on the world. And when we put something on and we feel like it is designed to accentuate our body instead of our face, and we have to go into work and we're wondering all day, like, oh, how, like, am I feeling good in it? Am I feeling confident in it? Versus like, yeah, I got it.
When you put on Naomi Nomi, I want you to feel like your best friend just called you and gave you the pep talk.
I love that. If it's not your slogan, it should be.
You know the feeling when like your friend just like called you up and you're like, oh, I don't know if I should like take that class. It's the harder class. Like, I don't know if I like, am I really good enough to be in that class? And your friend's like, fuck you. Of course you are. Like, who do you think you are, Danielle? Like, you're the best, you know, like, and they just like pump you up like crazy. Like, that's what I want my clothes to feel like.
Yeah. And I know that they do, because it's been a few years now of doing it. Why is the small batch side important to you?
Oh, it's incredibly important to me because it's sort of the lens with which I come to this as a sculptor. Making things is really, excuse my language, fucking hard. It is a privilege of my life to be able to make things. And I say that knowing though that it is the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Making something in glass, making something in clay, making something in fabric. Like, it's hard on my body. It's hard on my mental state. It's hard on my nerves. It's hard on the environment. It's hard on my bank account. It is not easy. There's no way in hell that it is easy from any direction. And because of that, I think about waste. So like, if it's really, really hard, therefore we want to do it as efficiently as possible so that we can eliminate any waste that we have. And of course, there's all the aspects of waste, 100%. That is obviously something that I like think about all the time. And it is a hugely active aspect of my business on the production side. But what I actually think about the most is wasting a seamstress's time. I'm a maker, and making things takes time. And if a human is making it, the most valuable thing that they have is their time. And so there is no way in hell that I'm going to ask a seamstress to sit down and sew 7,000 garments if I don't know that every single one of those is going to be used and loved. And the idea of making a sculpture without an audience, like that never gets its audience, is like, would you perform for no one? No. Like, the garment should only be made if someone knows that they want it. And so that's the reason we're made to order, because it's like it's anathema to me, the concept of like making something that just goes in a landfill. Like, that's just devastating to me. Like beyond the, like, that's even taking out the huge chunk of like the landfill part, you know, like even before we get to the landfill, like a woman has spent time, and usually a woman has spent time away from a child, a friend, a person that they love, to be at a sewing machine, to be making that garment. And if I'm gonna use her time, I'm not gonna waste her time. So that's why we're gonna swap.
Expected and incredible.
Friday.
So fun. Yeah. Can learn more about Naomi and her wonderful fashion label, Naomi Nomi, at the links in our show notes.
Thank you so much, Danielle. It's a total pleasure.
Since you've made it to the end of the show, I'm going to take a wild guess that you enjoyed listening. So go ahead, check out the links in the show notes and give us a follow. We both know you want to. Unboxing Humans is hosted by me, Danielle Boris. To learn more about my work, go to danielleboris.com, and don't forget to grab your copy of my new book, The Energy of Weirdos. See you next week, and have a fantastic rest of your day.